Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
The interview series, Reflections in Time, was begun by the late Professor Paul Borghi more than 20 years ago. This new series continues Paul's work and is dedicated to his memory. My name is Jack Newton. I'm retired now, but I'm still active as a professor emeritus. I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960, and I served for 20 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I worked closely with Professor Borghi in the development of his original interview series, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue this work. We're here this afternoon in the studios of KYNE Television. It's a late day in January, typical January day, years 2001, and I have as my guest Dr. John Kasher from the Department of Physics here at UNO, longtime professor of physics. Welcome, Jack. It's good to have you here with us.
Very nice to be here, Jack.
You're currently professor of physics, and I know you've been here for a good many years.
It's been 33. Yeah.
33 years.
Yeah.
Wow. The time goes by pretty quickly.
I know it does.
You know, I've known you, I think, most of that time, and it occurs to me I've never asked you much about yourself, about your roots. Where do you come from? Are you originally from Omaha? Or?
Well, I was born in Urbana, Illinois in 1938, and when I was 7 years old, our family moved to Omaha, and I moved here, started second grade in St. Cecilia's grade school, and went to Creighton Prep High School, graduated in '56, and then I joined the Jesuits, and I was a member of the Jesuits for 10.5 years.
Oh, so, well, you're not a native Omahan, but you're about as close to it as
That's
most
right.
people get.
Yeah, I really consider myself kind of a native Omahan, yeah.
And then when you finished your high school program, you went on to college. Where did you go to college?
Well, in the Jesuits, I went to several different places. I went to Oshkosh, Wisconsin for a couple of years, Florissant, Missouri for a couple of years. Then I went down to Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama, and that's where I studied physics. And at the end of that 3-year period, 7 total years, I got my BS in physics.
What got you interested in that field?
Well, I was always very interested in math. I always liked it, and I felt like I could do pretty well in it. But it never seemed to be quite enough. I liked the idea of taking math and applying it to the physical world, and that's what physics does. So that was kind of a double satisfaction for me. So I went into physics. Don't regret it at all. No,
certainly not an easy thing to major in from the way most students look at it anyhow.
Well, I guess that's kind of the perception, but if you like something and
especially if you do well in the math.
That's right, yeah, that's a big, big help, that's right.
Right. And then after you finished your undergraduate degree, you went on to graduate school. Was there anything in between? Or?
While I was still in the Jesuits,
yes.
I took a year and I taught at St. Francis High School in St. Francis, South Dakota, the Indian mission out there. And then after that year, I went up to Boston College. And
teaching science there in high school?
I was teaching arithmetic and science. One interesting thing was, I had a 7th and 8th grade arithmetic class, and I had kids in the class that ranged from the 91st percentile down to the 1st percentile in a smooth progression. How do you teach a class
like that? So that's
a
bit of a challenge. Huh?
It really was. But yeah, so I did have a year of teaching, and then I went to graduate school in physics at Boston College.
In Boston College, that was about what year you started there?
I started there in '64, and I had a NASA fellowship and studied there for, I forget what it was, about 3 years, I guess. And at the end of that 3-year period, I was really tired of working on my dissertation, so I just took a break and came home and worked construction in Omaha and met Mary Jean, and we became engaged, and then I decided, well, I could work on my dissertation here. So I stayed here in the fall semester, and then job at UNO came up, and so I started in February of '68.
How did you find out about the job at UNO?
Well, it
wasn't UNO then, was it?
It was
Omaha University?
The first semester I taught, that spring of '68, was the last semester as Omaha University, and then we went over to Nebraska, Omaha. After that, in the summer, there was the transition. But I don't know how the job came up. I heard of it, I guess, but I applied for it. And I had my master's degree at the time, and there was one other fellow with a master's degree from Lincoln, and Professor McMillan interviewed both of us, and he decided that I would get the job. So I got the job, fortunately, because a year later, President Nixon cut the space program. 1 year after, there were just 2 people with master's degrees for an open position at the physics department. UNO got 135 unsolicited applications from people with PhDs for a position that wasn't there.
What a big change.
I'll tell you, if I had not started when I did, I wouldn't be here, I'm sure, right now.
And the Professor McMillan you mentioned was John McMillan, who for years was head of the physics department.
He's really, really...
and going back, way back to Omaha University.
Way back before I got here, and he was quite an old gentleman. He really was. He had a lovely wife, and he just ran the department until I don't remember when he stepped down, 1980 or something like that, somewhere in there. But he did a very fine job.
Yeah, he was department chair when I first became dean back in the mid-'70s.
Wow, so, yeah, we were all under him at that point.
Yeah, I had a lot of respect for him.
I remember one story about him. He was pretty much in charge of the budget, and he could rule that with an iron fist, I guess. I'm not sure that's how it works so much now, but as department chair. And he fell in love with this grading machine that cost $1,700, and the rest of us thought that was just a crazy idea. But he wanted it, so he bought it, and boy, we have been using it ever since. We're wearing the thing out. Everybody's so...
I'm surprised it isn't worn out by now. That was a few years ago.
Well, yeah, at least 20-plus years, but I use it to grade all my astronomy tests, and so does everybody else.
Kind of does multiple choice grading.
That's right, and just flips it right through. So I'm really glad he got it.
It's probably an antique, well, not only an antique, but it's probably obsolete now.
Obsolete machine that works.
Yeah.
Still works fine for me.
Doesn't that read punch cards or something?
Yeah.
Or mark cents?
Well, it marks, I don't know how it reads, but it marks on the side of it. And these aren't punch cards, these are black.
They mark them with
pencils,
so it's not like the
must be an optical reader or something.
Cards that we
not Florida
in the last presidential
no, we didn't
election.
have any hanging chads for extra credit on our tests.
Well, you obviously made a decision early on to go on and complete the PhD in physics.
That's right. Yeah.
But as you said, you came here before you'd finished your doctorate.
That's right. Degree. Yeah.
That must have been tough to finish a dissertation while you're teaching full time.
Boy, it really takes a certain amount of discipline. I noticed. I taught. I had summers, I guess, a little bit summers, but I was well enough along on my dissertation so that I really could work pretty well by myself, and then call my advisor, and I went out to see him the January before I started teaching, that sort of thing. It works out pretty well, but...
That's a long way between
Omaha and Boston. Yeah. Well, and you have to keep focused. It would be very easy to let it slip away.
You didn't have electronic mail back then.
No, that's right. No emails. So you would phone, or you just go out and confer. Yeah. But I kept at it and got the job done. Yeah, it was kind of living 2 lives for a while, trying to do research and do all my teaching. And these were courses that I just started, so I had to do all my notes and work the whole thing up myself. But it happened.
From all your time in Boston, you never picked up a Boston accent or anything?
I did at one time. I had a little bit, but it goes away. I've been around here long enough, so it's an Omaha accent.
I used to spend all my summers working in the Boston area for a number of years. And when our older son was born, he was just, that first one summer we were working there, he was just learning to talk. And when he came back, you'd ask him, "Who are you? What's your name?" And he'd say, "My name is Pita." He picked up that Boston pronunciation very quickly.
Yeah, I picked up a little southern accent when I was in Alabama, but that went away too.
So really, this job at UNO was your first full-time job, in
really
a sense,
is.
except for that teaching
you can count the year at the Indian Mission, but I was kind of a Jesuit scholastic, doing a year of teaching, essentially. And so really, this is my first job, I guess. And it's the only one, 33 years.
Well, you'd lived in Omaha for a while, so you knew the university was here.
That's
and
right.
You probably knew something about it, but had you been on the campus much at all here?
You know, it's really kind of funny. When I went to prep for high school,
Yes.
and I played for St. Margaret Mary's CYO baseball team, and we would do our practices over, I guess it would be where Durham Science Center is now, and that was just a huge open field. So we'd have our baseball practices over there, and so yeah, it certainly changed an awful lot. I took a speed reading course when I was at prep out here at Omaha U, and it's just a totally different place now.
So what was your, when you came here for a job interview, that must have been a little bit different than coming here as a softball player. What was your first impression of the, well, first of all, of the physics department, and secondly, of the university as a whole?
Well, I thought the university itself seemed like a very good place, and for me personally, this seems to be a good fit, because I kind of liked Omaha, and I had pretty much decided I'd probably hang around here if I could find a place. I interviewed at Creighton at the same time and here, and Creighton didn't have a position open, and UNO did. At the time, I think Creighton had a lot stronger physics department than we did. We didn't have anybody with a PhD here, and so that was
only
really
a couple of faculty members, if I
yeah,
3 maybe. Or?
There was yeah, maybe 3 others besides myself. And one of them was kind of an engineer, and Charlie Sedlacek, and he went over to engineering. Bob Schmidt was here, and then we had another fellow that was here too, Jim, I forget his name. But there were no PhDs, and it's really changed drastically since then. We've really built up, I think, a very fine program in our department in the physics over the years from that time.
Your lab facilities, if I remember, were pretty Spartan.
Boy, I'll tell you, they really were. We had this general physics lab, but then we'd run all our laboratories in and have to set it up and tear it down. And I think that was about it. I think we had a physical science course, too, that we would have in another place, but that was really much it, and no research laboratories, and essentially no research being done here at all. And then we decided, especially since we got 135 unsolicited applications, it was easy enough to find PhDs, and so the department started building itself up. I finished my PhD, and then one by one we would hire people, and everybody we hired had Dr. Gunther, Dr. Flocken.
Right.
They would all have PhDs. Dr. Graham didn't at the time, but he was hired essentially to teach, and he's a very excellent teacher, and he has since gotten his PhD. But essentially, we now have a faculty of PhDs here. And so that's been a big change.
And some of them very active researchers.
Very, very competent people. And a number of them have had some big research grants, and I think doing really, really good work. So I think it's a very strong department. I think we have good teaching, and we have good research here.
Back when you first came here, what was the curriculum like? With limited lab facilities, you couldn't have had a huge lab course.
We didn't really have a lot of physics majors, but we did have, actually the laboratories were quite a bit different now that I'm thinking about all this. We now have advanced physics laboratories for our majors, and it's a 1-hour course, and they do a series of experiments. Back at that time, the laboratories were linked to the specific courses. I taught electromagnetic theory back then. I still do, but for the first time, and there was a lab associated with it, so I had to set up all the experiments, and we had a modern physics course for our majors, and there was a modern physics lab. So they were all different. Each lab had its own set of experiments, and we had to figure out and set them up, plus the general physics laboratories. And the physics majors laboratory was clear down in the basement in this building. You open up this dungeon door and walk in and do your experiments. So it was like that way for a while, yeah.
A little bit different than what you left when you were in graduate school at Boston College.
I'll say, I did a theoretical thesis, so I was never in a laboratory, but I certainly walked through, and a lot of the other graduate students were, and all this equipment, and big difference between undergraduate and graduate physics.
Well, I remember even back in the early 70s when I was, when I first became Arts and Science Dean, talking with the department chairman, I'd be told, well, we're emphasizing people with a theoretical rather than an experimental background because we don't have the laboratory facilities and we couldn't support the experimental research, whereas we can get computer time, and that's what the theoreticians need.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I'm a theoretician, Flocken's a theoretician, right. And I guess Gunther started out as an experimentalist. He was kind of the first one we tried to set up.
Yes, he was building a
Yeah, he had to build his lab, though,
yeah.
And so it is much easier. That was a very wise decision to have a theoretician-based faculty because of the fact that it's very expensive to get good equipment, and money might be better spent elsewhere, I think.
But you did have a curriculum. You did have some physics majors. Not
That's right.
Many, but
and we had the regular courses for a major.
And you have a huge service component, both for arts and science
right.
students and for engineers, I presume.
Yeah, a lot of our general physics courses were service courses. We do the same thing now. We have a whole bunch of. Actually, we've added some whole calculus-based physics course to the curriculum since the IS&T started over there, and we have 80 or 90 students in that are mostly from the new engineering program. And then we have about, I don't know, 6 or 7 astronomy sections with 60 people in them every
that's
semester.
become quite popular, hasn't
Yeah,
it?
it really has. So that's a big service element, too.
We'll have to talk a little bit more about that before we finish.
Sure, that'd
today.
be fine. I wish everybody had to take astronomy. I think it's one of the best subjects you could take.
Yeah, I agree. I'm trying, well, I don't want to introduce too many personal experiences here, but my son went to the University of Michigan, and in the honors program there, he got in an honors astronomy course to begin with as a freshman, working with all of the big guns in astronomy at Michigan, and he's just loved that ever since. He's been just fascinated with astronomy.
Yeah, we should know about our universe, and this is the best way to do it.
Well, you didn't spend all of your time here because you take off in the summers sometime after a while anyhow, after a few years.
Yeah.
And you used to go out to California, if I remember.
Yeah, that was really a wonderful experience. Actually, from 1979, the summer, until January of '92, I spent every summer at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and then after about 4 or 5 years, I became a consultant, so I'd go out for a few weeks during the year, too, during breaks. And for the first 8 summers or something like that, I took my family out with me, and we'd rent a house or an apartment, and we'd stay out there and really have a good time.
Those summer jobs are, I think they're one of the major advantages of being a college professor. Sometimes I used to work on the East Coast, and we'd rent a cottage on the ocean, and
sure. There's just really nothing like. I think we saw more California than most Californians because they just sit there because it's always, they can always go there.
Well, tell us about Livermore. I know what it is, and obviously you do because you worked there, but maybe there are people in our audience who haven't heard of it. What is the Lawrence Livermore National Lab?
It's a top-rate, first-class national laboratory. It's
owned by the federal government?
Well, it's I'm not sure about ownership. I know that it was run by the University of California Board of Regents, at least while I was working there. And so they were given about $3 million a year to administer it, so we were actually under their employment, so to speak. But it's half military defense contracts and half just regular research, and astronomy, astrophysics, all kinds of different, just regular physics and chemistry and whatever research. I worked for the military part of it. I studied the physics of the effects of nuclear weapons, mostly, several different aspects of it. I worked on the Star Wars program a little bit too while I was out there. I had a security clearance and had to show your badge and go in, and I worked in a security area when I was out there and had classified documents that I would be able to read. And also there was kind of a funny story. I wrote one once. This was a pretty sensitive topic that I was working on, and so I wrote a document. It was classified, and I found out later when I tried to get it from the library that it was classified above my level of classification, so I couldn't read it. But I mean, I could have gotten permission, but I thought that was kind of strange. That
those things happen.
Yeah, that's right. But it was very interesting work. I worked on a microwave laser as part of the Star Wars program. The idea was to, if you could penetrate a microwave laser beam through the atmosphere to destroy incoming missiles, and the feasibility of that. And so that was, the physics of it was extraordinarily interesting because it's right on the edge, the far edge of extreme physics, and so it was really a challenge, and just you apply these regular principles way out here, and so it was really interesting work.
Did that have any effect on you as a teacher here when you came back from there in the summertime?
Yeah, quite a bit, as a matter of fact, because I have more or less taught our electromagnetic theory course for our physics majors since the early 70s. There were a couple times I didn't, but we teach it every 2 years. And I worked essentially on electromagnetic theory, so while I'm teaching, there would be this and that and other applications I could always mention, and that really livens up the course when you're doing it. That you can say, actually, yeah, this is not just stuff we're learning, because here's how I used it out in Livermore. In fact, I did that about 2 weeks ago in our class here. It still hangs around. The method of images, I showed that I did something out there with it in our course. So yeah, electromagnetic theory is a very, very important area of physics, and I could show that it was by drawing on these really neat examples that I was involved in.
How did you get started out there? What led you to
I got one of these flyers. You know, they send flyers around to all universities, and I got this flyer, and I thought, well, it'd be fun to go out there for the summer. And it just happened that what I had worked on for my dissertation kind of fit this general thing that they were interested in, so they hired me, and I did a good enough job, so they hired me the next summer, and then I learned how to use their computer. And so, you know, once you get started, then they know you, and they know what you can do, and you already are familiar, so then you just keep going, and it's just expected that you just keep going out there. They had, I don't know what they do now, but they had the largest and most complete and biggest computer facility and capacity in the world at the time. So it's really a top-notch place.
And then, let's see, just while we're on the topic of working during the summer and the various laboratories, you after you finished the work or after you stopped working at Livermore, you started working for a NASA project.
Yeah, that's right. I could kind of see the handwriting on the wall in Livermore because they were being cut back. The Star Wars program was being cut down, and that's essentially what I was doing the last few years I was there. And so they let their consultants go first, and I saw that coming. So we applied for this Jove grant with NASA, and you were part of that too.
Yes.
In fact, you went to one of the conferences with us, didn't you? And so that came through, and so I spent the summer of, I think it was '91, down in Huntsville, Alabama, and we were studying the surface of the sun, supergranules, and it's very interesting work too. They didn't quite have the facilities that Livermore did. But it was interesting work and good theory, and got involved in that. And then part of the grant was we came back here and had a couple more summers that were funded by it. And then we would work during the year. And I've kind of been off and on with that, continuing with that since that time. And there have been, 1 or 2 papers that have been published as a result of what we've been doing out there. So that was heavily computerized work too. But it was very interesting too. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that must have been to be down at the in Huntsville at the big
Marshall Space Flight Center. Yeah, that's really quite a facility, and that's where some of the astronauts train for some of their exercises. And we were in the Surface Science Laboratory, which is another section of the whole place. But there's a lot of good science that was going on there. That was fun too.
Yeah, I'm sure you got occasionally some tours or something of the various sections and got to see what was going on.
I think every week we had a meeting, and we'd have a 1-hour tour of something, or somebody would talk to us, and so they showed us what was there and all that sort of thing, and told us about their project. Yeah, it was very, very informing. Not only the research that we did, but just learning about the facility was really good too.
Did you ever get down to Florida and see a missile launch or anything like that?
We didn't at that time. It was planned to do that, but I forget what came up. I don't remember. We never did see the shuttle take off. I know that a year or 2 after that, I know that the people that went down for the program actually did go down to Cape Canaveral and saw the shuttle take off.
But just to be involved in that must have been a great experience.
I'm trying to go back and forth. I think we did go down there, but there was no shuttle launch at that time. And we toured the facility.
I think at some point here, maybe now is a good time for it, since we're talking about NASA and space and so on, we need to talk about one of the things that you've become famous for.
One of my hobbies, yeah.
And that's your interest in unidentified flying objects.
That's right.
UFOs.
Yeah, that's right.
How did you get interested in that?
Well, I think everybody's interested in it.
Yeah.
And in the early 1970s, somebody came to me and asked me if I'd be willing to be a consultant for the Mutual UFO Network, that's an international organization that's dedicated to the scientific study of UFOs. So I said okay, and I didn't really do much. But then in the, I don't know what happened, but in the mid to late 80s, 86, 87, I just became intensely interested in UFOs. So I started reading about them, and going to conferences and meeting people, and became a member of MUFON, and then kind of climbed the ladder again. I'm a consultant, then I'm also the state director for Nebraska, and I'm central regional director. I'm in charge of 20 states with MUFON. And it just is kind of, one thing has really just led to another, and you start meeting all these people, and then start doing research, and there it goes.
Well, you gave me a list, and there are dozens and dozens of speeches and television programs, and I mean, you've been on national television.
National television probably a dozen times, I guess, or so, in Europe also, and given, I would guess, more than 200 talks or appearances, a lot of them locally too, Kiwanis clubs and faculty women here. In fact, you introduced me for that talk, and so it's really been something. I guess one reason I'm so interested in it is I think, first of all, that it's true. I think extraterrestrials are visiting us, but I really think that there is enough good scientific evidence to prove that, and I feel it's kind of a mission of mine to try to show people that there is and convince them, because this completely changes our ideas of the universe. I mean, it's one of the biggest stories in the history of the world, if it's true.
Well, I suspect that that's one of the reasons you've been in such demand as a speaker, is that, as you said, everybody's interested in it, but you approach it from the point of view of good science, and with a reputation for knowing some physics, and
that's right,
and for having an unbiased view.
Well, yeah, and there are a lot of wild people waving their hands and willing to accept anything, and that I just don't accept that. That's not my point of view. I think I kind of try to stand in the middle and be a skeptic in the good sense, where you need evidence to prove it. And there is some good science to be done. My main claim to fame is an analysis of a videotape taken from the shuttle. I don't want to go into too great detail on it, but that's really what I have been talking about for most of my appearances on national television. And I also published a 70-page article in a referee journal about it. The Journal of UFO Studies is an academic referee journal, and it was tough to get by those referees. It's the toughest article I've ever had to get published, but it was. And so there is a lot of good science that can be done. That's the attitude I try to take when I do it. I don't try to force my opinion down anybody's throat, but I am convinced of what I'm doing.
What were some of the national TV shows you appeared on? Do you recall which? I mean, ones that people who are listening to this now might recognize?
They might. The one on NBC was Confirmation, the Evidence of UFOs, some title like that, and then UFOs, the Best Evidence Ever on Videotape. That was on Fox, and then there was UFOs, Best Evidence on Videotape 2. I don't think I was on that one, but Sightings, I was on the Sightings show. In fact, that was my first appearance on national television. There's a funny story. I don't know why they do this, but they flew me out to Los Angeles and put me up overnight, and I went to the studio, and then they sat me down. We had a person at a desk like you are. Instead of me sitting here talking to him, they put me off in a corner with a microphone on and an earplug in, as if I were back here at UNO. And so I sat there pretending I was here at UNO, and the announcer was 15 feet away from me, and we were talking back and forth, and he would say, "Dr. Kasher, this," and then they'd put the camera on me, and I would answer as if we were 1,500 miles apart. I could never quite figure out why they did it that way.
Did you meet any interesting people in the course of doing all of these shows?
Yeah, certainly. Especially this show on NBC, they had several people, and Whitley Strieber was out there filming the same time I did, so I got to talk to him, and we chatted for a while, and Bruce Maccabee is an optical physicist who is an extremely good and competent UFO researcher. He lives on the East Coast, and I got to really meet him and talk to him for the first time too. And I've spoken at a number of UFO conferences, and I've met a number of the really good people. Stan Friedman is a nuclear physicist, and he's a UFO researcher, and I've spoken with him a number of times about these things. Actually, he visited the UNO campus once and gave a talk here too.
Well, let's come back to UNO. Let's talk about some of the things you've done here. You've had, I'm sure you're too modest to mention them yourself, but that doesn't keep me from mentioning them. You've had many honors and recognitions for your teaching and your research here on the campus. You won the coveted Excellence in Teaching Award, which is a very nice honor.
Yeah.
That was back in the 80s.
85, I think, or so.
And then you held a professorship, a named professorship here, the Peter Kiewit Distinguished Professor, also in the 80s.
That's right. That was from 81 through 87, I think, yeah.
And for the benefit of our audience, those named professorships are endowments that not only give you the distinction of having that after your name, but also give you a few extra dollars in your paycheck.
That's right.
Which is always
it
nice.
was really, what was particularly satisfying with the Peter Kiewit Award was the professorship, was that it was given both for teaching and research.
Right.
And so I found that really satisfying.
And the Burlington Northern Faculty Achievement Award was another one. And,
that's right, yeah.
And you were a nominee for several national awards as well.
That's right, yeah. I was UNO's nominee for a Case Professor of the Year, I guess. That was in the 80s sometime, too.
Yeah. So those are all very nice things to
well,
have
I feel
happen
very
to
happy
you.
And kind of humbled to have gotten those. And I'm really grateful. I was actually at my desk in Livermore, and Del Weber, who was the chancellor, called me and told me that I got the Peter Kiewit Award. And so I had to take a break and walk around the lab a little bit and settle down and then come back.
Now that's a nice and well-deserved honor. You mentioned this research and teaching, and we've talked a little bit about your research. Let's talk a little bit about your teaching. You've developed some interesting courses, and I think one of my favorites, because it was done while I was dean, is the interdisciplinary science course.
That's right.
Could you tell us something about that? That's a little different than what
yeah, it really is. We decided that actually it was an outgrowth of another course that we may get to talk about it. We'll see, but we'll talk about this one first. I had team taught a course with Gonzalo Munevar, which had space and space exploration.
Dr. Munevar was in the philosophy department.
That's right. And so he got a grant, and so we developed an NSF. It was an NSF grant. We developed a course, and so we taught it for 10 years. And then he left, and so I really couldn't handle the philosophy part of it. And so the idea was then, this was such a good idea that space was a good basis for teaching a course because everybody finds it so interesting. And then the idea of the interdisciplinary science was coming in at the time. And so we kind of got together, and Bob Egan and George Pfeffer and Jeff Peek and I.
So we have
Bob
Egan, who's a biologist.
Yeah. And George Pfeffer,
who a chemist.
Yeah, and he's left, but he was a chemist. And then Jeff Peek is a geologist or geographer.
Physical geography.
Yeah. And so we decided we would just get together, and each one of us would teach a segment and have space as the main theme. And so we developed.
Did you try and tie these together then?
As much as possible.
That's how you used the space theme?
Yeah. In fact, the first time we taught it, we didn't really do this all the way through afterwards, but the first time we taught it, we all were in the classroom. And so not only would somebody be up there with his 2 or 3 weeks and then somebody else would take over, but we were all in kind of feeding ideas, and the students were there, and it was really a good challenging situation. And I don't know that much about biology, so if Bob was up there talking, then I could say, well, what about this? And then try to tie it in with physics a little bit. And so it was really good. It
must have been pretty exciting for students.
Yeah, it really was. In fact, we started out with 8, first time I was taught, and then it just mushroomed up, and we had to cap it at 48 because of the lab space, but we could have easily handled more. It was a really neat 5-hour course with a lab.
I'm sure it took a while for students to learn that this was a good course to take, because it's very unusual. 8 people was probably a good size group to get there that first time when nobody knew about it.
That's right, yeah. And so we did, and then as time went on, Bob Egan was a little bit too busy to do the biology part, so we got someone else. We tried to get somebody else, and then we finally went with 3, and then George Pfeffer left, and so it was just Jeff and I. So
is it still being taught?
It's not being taught now because it was just the 2 of us left, and so we
There was a time when we got interested in integrated curricula.
Yeah.
And we had 3 sets of courses. The first one, of course, was the humanities, and we'd had a integrated humanities course
That's
for
right.
a number of years. And then I tried as dean to get one in science and one in social science.
Yeah.
And so you folks developed that physical science.
Yeah, this was
one,
the science one.
Physical and biological science, but we never got anybody to do the social science, and I thought that was too bad, because as a social scientist myself, I thought it would have been fun. If I hadn't been dean, I would have been too busy. I would have done it myself.
Well, it was a really good teaching experience, and you could really tell a lot of the students really learned a lot of things that they wouldn't have. And getting it from different scientists with different points of view was very valuable.
And it wasn't a watered-down course at
No,
all.
no,
I remember we insisted at the time that this not be an easy course for somebody to take. It be a very meaningful. Yeah,
it was rigorous. They had to work.
Course.
Yeah, they had to work, but it was really a good, valuable thing to have, I think.
Great.
And it's kind of too bad that it has slipped away, but that's kind of how it goes, I guess.
Well, you mentioned that other course, the one you developed first with
That's
Dr.
right.
Navar, was it Philosophy of Space
That's right.
Exploration?
That's what it was called.
Could you tell us something about that?
Yeah, we first taught that in 1980. He got an NSF grant for quarter time for each of us to develop it in the fall, and then we taught it in the spring together. And there was a lot of philosophy involved, and Gonzalo taught that, and there was a lot of physics involved, and so I taught that, and we brought in a lot of different things. We brought in relativity, and gravity, and space, and showed some really neat movies that NASA has, and it was really a good thing. And we did it. We taught it, I can't remember if we taught it every year. I think maybe it was every other year, but we taught it up until about 1988 or 89, and then Gonzalo left. And I had all these notes, but there was only half the course. So then we developed the other one.
Well, you've really kept up. I remember back, must have been about that same time, the 70s and 80s, when just about every year you went to one of these summer, or not summer necessarily, but NSF, National Science Foundation sponsored Chautauqua, 4-day Chautauqua.
That's right. Yeah, normally the procedure was you go for 2 days in the fall, and then you have a project, and you go back for 2 days in the spring, and a number of different topics. That was really very helpful. They were really designed to give you material that you could then incorporate into your courses, and it really did that, did a good job. I'm still teaching some of the material I got from them, or something will float into your head that came from that, and so it really does work.
Yeah. Which physics courses have you enjoyed most in your many years of teaching physics?
Boy, I've taught most of them. I haven't taught quantum mechanics. I have really enjoyed electromagnetic theory. That's one of my favorites. I enjoyed mechanics. I taught that a time or two. Astronomy is really, really one of my pet projects. And I really enjoy the ideas involved in astronomy, and I think everybody should learn astronomy because it's such a wonderful topic. So that's probably my favorite, electromagnetic theory. I do enjoy teaching. I teach the calculus-based general physics, and I really do enjoy doing that too. I think there's a lot of good things about physics that people learn and don't realize that they know even. So those are probably my favorite. I could go on and talk. I taught astrophysics, relativity actually. Now that I think about it, I developed that course here, and that's always been one of my my favorite topics. And the students find the same thing. It's just such a weird topic, and that's one of my favorite ones to teach too. I haven't taught that one for a while, but it really is good. There are a lot of different. It's hard for me to answer that because I have enjoyed teaching a lot of them. Yeah, that's right.
Great. Tell me a little bit more. You said astronomy was one of your particularly, or an area that you're particularly interested in, and yet we're not. We don't have a big astronomy program or anything here. We have some fine courses, but
that's right.
We don't have a major or anything like that. And
that's right.
We don't. Have we access to? The students have access to any astronomical observation type of...
Yeah, they really do. In fact, one extra credit thing I offer to them when I teach it, and so do the other teachers, is we have a really nice facility out at Neil Woods out here, north of Hummel Park. They've got a number of very nice telescopes out there, and very frequently on Friday nights they have nights open to the public. And those are really good nights. They give a little lecture and then they go outside and look through the telescopes. And so that's a really good experience for the students. And I tell them, boy, you just have so many beautiful pictures and slides and movies that you can show when you teach a course like astronomy. But I tell them there is just nothing like seeing it for themselves. And I remember the first time I looked through a telescope and saw Saturn. Boy, it just takes your breath away. Yeah. And then I make them write up maybe a 1- to 2-page summary of what they think about their experience when they go out there, and that comes through so frequently.
Now, is Neil Woods far enough away from the city lights so that you can...
it kind of you kind of have some lights in the southern sky, but all the rest of the sky is fine. And so there are plenty of regions that you can look at out there.
We have some sort of a setup on the roof of the Science Center.
We have some good telescopes up there. It's inside the city, so of course you have that problem. Right. But still, you can look at planets very nicely, and the moon certainly, and you could do some deep sky looking. Not a great deal, but you can get somewhat of an appreciation for it. In fact, we've done that in our astronomy course too. We've taken people upstairs to look out at night astronomy. But Neil Woods is the better place to go, because it does at least have the dark north sky out there.
And then, if I remember correctly, one of the things that your department insisted on when we built the new science building, it was new a few years ago, the Durham Science Center, was that we include a planetarium in that building. That's right,
yeah. And that really is mostly for the general public, but it's a really nice facility. We have the shows on Friday night and Saturday, and I don't know if they do Sunday now too or not, but that's a really neat field trip. We have a whole bunch of field trips from people students that come from their schools, and they go in there and watch the regular shows that we have. It's really a nice facility.
A way to get them interested in astronomy early on.
That's right. We used to teach astronomy in there too, but you don't really use the planetarium so much when you do astronomy, and it's just kind of hard to bring things in for your audio visuals and demonstrations. So we have a better setup where we teach it now. One of these better classrooms with a computer in it, large screen, and the ability to show slides and the whole business.
Now that whole building is a nice facility. Did that change your world when
That's another big change. Yeah, I had an office in this building before until
this engineering building.
Yeah, and well, I don't remember when we went over in the 80s. I don't remember how long we've been over there. But yeah, that's just a whole different thing. Nice offices, nice new facilities, good big classrooms, and they planned it well. They did a good job.
And it's got some research laboratories.
Yeah, and we have some good, I think there's some good chemistry being done over there too in their laboratories, and we have some good physicists who have their research laboratories. We have Dr. Holloway has one of the strongest magnets around.
Yes.
I tell my students, don't walk too close to it because it'll pull your keys out. No, I'm just kidding. But he's got that, and then we've got other facilities that are experimental facilities that are really good. Solid surface physics, actually, is what a lot of it is, both theoretical and experimental. So it's a good blend in our department. I really am proud of our department.
Well, you have a very strong research record. Some would say that it's a model for what a UNO professor ought to be doing, both in research and teaching, a good mix, very strong. How did you manage to do this research? I guess we've addressed it a little bit in terms of your summer assignments and so on, but how did you manage to become this kind of a researcher in an exclusively undergraduate department? There's no graduate degree offered in physics here at all, is there?
Well, as far as most of my research, actually I did research before I went to Livermore. I went there in '75, and I published several papers after I got my PhD in 1971 or so, but those were really kind of sequels of the theoretical work I'd done on my dissertation, and so that was kind of feeding on itself. But then from '75 through '92 or so, most of my research was done in Livermore. I was able to bring some of it back and kind of tinker around a little bit with it here. But they had the facilities, and they really kept my mind going. I mean, I'd be out there for 14 weeks during the summer or so, and then a couple over Christmas and a week at spring break, so that's a lot of time. And 17 weeks, it's about a third of the year, isn't it? Yeah, so that really kept it going.
So that was sort of a substitute for the for the stimulation you'd get from having a graduate course where
That's
you're
right.
teaching graduate students and exchanging ideas.
That's exactly right. There was the exchange of ideas, but it was with the people that were working
Right.
out there. And so I was able to do that in a completely undergraduate department, carry on a fairly strong research program because I was involved with Livermore.
But you still didn't have the graduate research assistants and
No,
so on that
no.
that might have been helpful.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And in some ways, I'm kind of glad that we don't. Well, I'm not glad that we don't. I mean, because they help with
Yeah.
it. But I'm really proud of our department in the sense that all of our courses, except for the labs, which are run very competently by our physics majors, are taught by PhDs, and we don't have that layer that schools with heavy graduate programs have, that where you have a lot of graduate students teaching some of these regular courses that I'm teaching now, general physics and so on. I think that really makes us a very strong department, that we have PhDs teaching these courses, and that's another reason I'm really kind of proud of our department, that we have such a strong set of teachers with a strong background teaching all of our physics courses, both for the majors and the service courses too.
That's one thing that I know I was always proud of and talked about when I was dean of the college, and that is that UNO has undergraduate programs that we can really be proud of.
That's
because,
right.
Because we haven't put all our emphasis on graduate programs.
Yeah, and I don't want to, I mean, I don't want to compare us locally to the colleges, but I don't know how many times I've had people come up to me that they would say from Iowa State, taking a summer course, or from Kansas, or from California, Berkeley, and they would take my physics course, and they would say, I really wish I had something like, they had something like this out at Berkeley. And one girl said that she had 700 people in her course, and you can see right away why. And the same thing at Kansas. That's a very top-notch school, but this one girl said that this course was much better.
Get more individual attention.
More individual attention. She had 500 in her class, and somebody that had taken a physics course in Wyoming. I don't know how many people have told me that. So UNO is a very good school. And the fact that we have so many PhDs doing a lot of teaching is a real plus, I think, on the undergraduate level. You can really get a good education here.
Not that you can't with graduate assistants,
No,
too.
no, that's right. And I'm being careful not to downgrade anything.
Because sometimes
locally.
those graduate assistants who are, you know, perhaps close to the age of the students they're teaching, but, they're getting into the field, and they've got that enthusiasm.
That's right.
That really helps in the classroom too. So
that's right.
I can see arguments on both sides.
Yeah, it does work both ways. It really does. Yeah, but I think overall, I think I'm very proud of the level of teaching we have here at UNO.
We've talked about your research a little bit. Which of the various projects that you've worked on do you think you found most interesting?
Boy, I think probably my Livermore research has been very interesting. Actually, the most interesting research I think I've ever done is the report that I talked about my UFO research, that 70-page article in a refereed journal. That was very challenging and stimulating because of some of the methods I had to use as a scientist and physicist, and also because I essentially drew the conclusion that NASA was videotaping spacecraft that probably were extraterrestrial. So, I mean, that makes it kind of exciting, too.
When you use this term, refereed journal, just for the benefit of some of our audience that might not know what that is, this is it's a scientific publication where you have a board of editors who are distinguished scientists in their own right, who look over the things that are submitted and for publication and say, this is good stuff, or this is pretty good but not as good as this other.
Doesn't measure up.
And they reject a lot of things that are submitted.
Yeah, they really do. And as I mentioned before, I had two of the toughest referees I've ever had for this paper. I know one of them, I'm sure, worked for NASA. And another one, I don't know what his background.
Very often this is anonymous, and you don't know who these referees are.
That's right.
And they don't know who you are, so it can't be that they're picking up their friends. And
well, and then aside from that, the research in Livermore was really significant and interesting because, as I mentioned, it's really way out there. these nuclear weapons are very powerful, and they send out these electromagnetic pulses. I did a lot of work on electromagnetic pulses, which is a signal, aside from the fact that when a nuclear weapon goes off, it explodes and knocks down buildings, does a lot of damage, but it sends out an electromagnetic pulse that's very fast, and it can fry electronic systems. If the Russians, for example, would blow up a 1 megaton bomb about 300 miles above Kansas, it wouldn't do any damage to Kansas, but it potentially could fry all solid-state systems in the United States unless they're protected. And so I did a lot of that, figuring out how strong that was and whether it could actually damage the systems or not. And boy, that was really interesting physics. There were times out there I just couldn't wait to get into work the next day. It was so much fun.
Yeah. Well, before we're getting towards the end of our hour together here. We have a few minutes left, and one thing I want to be sure we get to talk about, something that I've always thought was one of the more important things that you've done in your service activities on campus, and that's your interest in a core curriculum for the university. Yeah. And well, why don't you tell us what a core curriculum is?
Well, a core curriculum is a set of courses that somebody decides would be good for everybody to take as a good foundation or basis for your education. Then you would fill that in with your major and with other courses, but it's a set of courses where they say, well, it'd be good to know about this topic a little bit, this topic, and these sets of topics, and everybody that has an education should know about these certain sets of topics. And so I was chair of the task force that was supposed to set up, or try to set up, a core curriculum that would apply to all UNO students.
So up until that time, every college had a different curriculum.
That's right.
Different core curriculum. So, you know, most they might have most of them required mathematics, for some degree of mathematics. Most of them had maybe a history course, or all of them had an English course. Some of them had a speech course, but they were different. And your job, if I am interpreting you correctly, was to chair a committee that tried to get people to agree that here's some minimum list of courses everybody ought to have.
Everybody ought to take these, and that was not an easy job, because you'd have to go to this college which has this and say, well, you may have to adjust this, this, and this, and then you go to another one and the same thing. And it was difficult to get everybody to come together, but it finally got done. It didn't quite, I mean, these things never work out quite the way you want to, but our group had certain sets of ideas and ideals, and they were altered a little bit, but finally there is one that is university-wide now, and I think it's really a good thing that we do.
Last year I interviewed former Vice Chancellor Otto Bauer, and he was the one that pulled this group together, and I think probably appointed you as chair of that committee.
Well, Chancellor Weber started, but then Otto was a big part of the process too, and he was always very interested in it, and we'd have a lot of, I still remember those meetings, boy. Everybody would have their own ideas.
What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced?
Biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges was going to every separate college and trying to convince them to change to accommodate what we had, because some of them really had to make some big changes. College of Fine Arts, essentially almost were afraid they were going to have to add a 5th year, because they were so heavily, especially in music, they had so many music courses that people would come out and were very, very well trained in music, but maybe didn't have enough background in other courses, and so that was a challenge to try to adjust that. And it eventually got done, but you have to do it college by college. And you know, one of the hardest groups was, I remember that debate we had in Arts and Sciences, and Arts and Sciences of all the colleges was the best prepared and had the most solid core that actually went beyond, in many ways, many areas, what we were trying to push. But we got us, everybody's in there going this way and that way and debating, but it finally got done in there too.
So the key thing here was that in the state of Nebraska, the University of Nebraska, on all its campuses, by statute, each college is independent.
That's right.
And can determine what their own curriculum is.
That's right.
So your job was to try, at least at UNO, to seek some agreement among these colleges that they would voluntarily accept these courses.
Yeah, and it had to be voluntarily. We couldn't tell them they had to do it. Right. Just had to really convince them. I know the education, College of Education was really, really helpful. They were really willing to bend, and that was one of the major problems, because they have all these education courses which might tend to cut out other ones, but they were very, very accommodating. It was really, really pleasing. Dick Flynn was in at that time, I think. And
well, a few years ago, you were on a review panel that looked back over this, weren't you?
That's right, yeah.
What did you find out?
We essentially found that it looked all right, that things were going along okay, and that we should try to keep it going.
Right.
And so it was a success, I guess you would say. Yeah. It worked.
There is some flexibility in that program. When we talk about everybody being required to have a course in public speaking, for example, there are half a dozen courses or so.
That's right.
You could take the beginning public speaking course to fulfill that requirement, or you could take something like argumentation and debate, and that would fill a requirement, because that requires public speaking.
Well, sure, and then, that's kind of the skill that you're after.
So there is some flexibility.
Yeah, and there are science courses that you would take, but there's a lot to choose from, a lot of different kinds of science courses. So it's not like everybody has to take this particular Psychology 111 or whatever it is. But still, it's the idea that you need to have this set of things that you learn when you leave here. And so that's
But even in science, we'd say, you can't do it all with physics. You've got to have some biology in there,
That's right, and that's very wise, too, You can't do it, even if you're a physics major, you really need to learn other sciences. And so that's the philosophy behind it.
You've had experience on a number of other, that was, I think, this core curriculum committee was a key one, my way of thinking, but you've certainly done many other things. You were on the University Honors Committee.
That's right,
improvement of instruction, that's helping make us all better teachers.
That's right, I was chair of both of those, actually at the same time, I think.
And you helped me as when you were on the Dean's Advisory Committee.
That's right, I was a chair of that for a year and on it for 3 years. That was back in the 70s. I mean, that goes way back, doesn't it?
And that's the committee that helps the dean decide who's going to get promoted. And
remember some, you really, those were tough meetings. Because you're really playing with somebody's future.
And one thing before we get off the instructional bandwagon here, let's mention one other thing, and that's the NASA Regional Teacher Resource Center.
That's right,
Could you tell us what your involvement is? Well, tell us what it is first. NASA Regional Teacher Resource Center is a center where local teachers can come to and copy slides, or there's a lot of material that they could take with them that is about the space program, and it's a really rich resource for them to go and develop modules to teach about space, and both from K1 to 12. And so it's a really valuable place. And I wasn't the one that did the whole thing. Of course, there are a lot of people involved, but I like to think at least that my involvement with NASA in this other grant that we talked about, and the fact that I went down to Huntsville and made some contacts, was very instrumental in initiating and starting this program. And I would contact the people and got the ball rolling and found out what had to be done. And so this is some place where teachers can come and get materials.
That's right.
Well, we're just about out of time, so I want to thank you for taking the time to join me this afternoon. It's been interesting and fun reminiscing about some of the old times here at University of Nebraska at Omaha. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today in a visit with Dr. Jack Kasher, professor of physics at UNO for many years. We've been taking a look at some of the history of UN Omaha as seen through the eyes of the history makers. This is Jack Newton inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.